Police arrest a 22-year-old man as the accused shooter who assassinated Charlie Kirk at a public debate on a Utah college campus this week. As Governor Spencer Cox details the evidence so far gathered, the messages on the bullet casings, while also rising to the occasion in calling for a better form of politics.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We're joined today by my colleagues on the editorial page, editorial board members Kate Batchelder Odell and Mene Uwe-Barua. We got him. That's how Utah Governor Spencer Cox began his news conference on Friday, announcing that police had detained and arrested Tyler Robinson, 22 years old, as the suspect in the fatal shooting of Charlie Kirk. Utah man. Some reports now filtering out about his background saying that he had a strong academic record, scholarships to attend Utah State University, but dropped out after one semester, voter registration records saying he was unaffiliated with any party and was inactive, meaning he probably had not voted in at least 2 general elections. Let's listen to a bit of that conference. This is Governor Spencer Cox detailing what they have learned about Tyler Robinson.
Investigators noted inscriptions that had been engraved on casings found with the rifle. Inscriptions on a fired casing read, "Notices, bulges, capital OWO, what's this, question mark." Inscriptions on the 3 unfired casings read, "Hey fascist, exclamation point, catch, exclamation point." Up arrow symbol, right arrow and symbol, and 3 down arrow symbols. A second unfired casing read, "Oh Bella Chow, Bella Chow, Bella Chow, Chow Chow." And a third unfired casing read, "If you read this, you are gay, LMAO.
Yesterday, I had cited some earlier reports that there was anti-fascist and pro-trans messaging on these casings. The first part of that seems to have been true. The second part seems to not be borne out by these more recent announcements. Kate, I mean, the fascist catch, that seems to be the most overtly political statement of any of these. The rest of this seems to be a mix of what is being described as online internet trolling culture, jokes. It seems like somebody who obviously clearly disturbed, but very online.
Right. I think what you're getting at is we are discussing 2 separate things here. The first is the question of his underlying political motivation. And I think the bullet that says, "Hey, fascist, catch," Spencer Cox, the governor of Utah, thought that spoke for itself. And I think that's true. And I think that does indicate, in addition to that conversation with the family member that the governor described, indicate that Charlie Kirk was chosen because of his views and because of what he was defending. He was accusing him of spreading hate. And I think there is a reality in which that the left has not reckoned with what it has unleashed when it starts to say things like words are violence. That is an open call to resort to violence for somebody. If somebody's out there spreading hate and that's violence, that is a call to arms. And so I think that there is certainly a political element of this that we cannot play down or ignore. On the second point, though, Kyle, there's also a contributing factor, which seems to be just the terrible influence of the internet at this point. I mean, this young man appears to have had, like you said, strong academic record, a good family life, but appears to have been spending a lot of time online. Appears to some of these bullet casings have been discussed, whether they're video game references, appears to have been marinating in an alternate reality. And that has been a percolating problem in our society for quite some time now, especially among disaffected young men. And so it is a combination of those two factors that I think led to this awful public murder this week.
Some of the evidence that Governor Cox discussed during this news conference was that the outfit, the clothing that he was wearing when he was arrested is consistent, matches some of the clothing that is apparently on the surveillance footage. The vehicle that apparently was driven matches a make and model of vehicle that he reportedly has. Also, some internet messages shared with law enforcement, according to this news conference, by his roommate. Discussions, messages about a rifle being wrapped in a towel, for example. Apparently, that matches the description of the rifle that was found by law enforcement near this campus. Another thing I think that bears noting, Monet, is that according to the police, this was a bolt action rifle. It sounds like the kind of thing that is in many people's homes for hunting, deer hunting, and whatnot. It does not match the kind of thing that is often a subject of political debate and controversy after one of these horrific events, when there is talk about gun control and whether new kinds of laws could have prevented this. I have not seen any reporting yet about how this assassin alleged obtained this weapon, and that is something we're going to have to wait to find out. But a lot of times there's conversations about what could have prevented this tragedy, and a lot of that often revolves around the make and model of the weapon. If it was a so-called assault rifle, if it was an AR-15, if it was a semi-automatic. And what is notable here, Monet, is that the answers to those questions seem to be no. This was a bolt action, which is the kind of weapon that is often left outside of those discussions by those who think that gun control is the answer and that we need to ban some more of these weapons.
Right. I think the point you make about the gun is important because it does get to the heart of why the discussions about regulating or even banning certain types of guns often aren't really germane to the issues in these types of shootings that we have, and why a lot of conservatives have reacted saying we don't think that this should be an occasion to revisit gun regulation in the aftermath of some of these tragedies. As you mentioned, it seems to be essentially a hunting rifle, the kind of high-powered rifle that would be used to shoot a deer. And something that a lot of gun rights advocates point out is that the power and the accuracy and the range of these guns is very similar to assault rifles. And so if you're going to go out and ban sporting rifles, saying that that's going to make people safer, you're not reckoning with the fact that you have guns which are in common use for different purposes, for hunting of all sorts of kinds, that would be much more difficult to ban or to regulate because so many people depend on them for these types of activities. And then the broader point that you made about some of the activities and identifying markers of Tyler Robinson that police discovered and have reported to the public. These comments about him being on Discord, I think there are two takeaways from that. One is that it's possible that he was in communication with somebody about what he was planning with regard to Charlie Kirk. If that's true, that's going to have to be followed down its course to see if he had accomplices or at least someone who was aware of it beforehand, and make sure that those people can be investigated and potentially brought to justice. We're so used to lone wolves in these types of shootings, but it is possible that it was some kind of coordinated attack, or at least that he had informed other people. And then it also gets to Kate's point about how a lot of people are stewing in some of these online communities and being reinforced in the dark actions that they're planning and trying to carry out. I do think that a lot of people's hunch, as soon as you hear of a shooting of this kind, is that the perpetrator was probably psychotic in some way or mentally troubled. But just like with Luigi Mangione, the killer of the United Healthcare executive, it doesn't really seem to be the case, at least at a clinical level, with what we know so far, that Tyler Robinson was mentally impaired or in any way. It seems as if he was just a guy who ended up in the wrong social circles and ended up, going down a very dark path. Of course, we'll learn more about him as time goes on, but I think we all need to be aware that there's more than a mental health side to this, that you have a lot of people who are becoming deranged politically, aside from any kind of clinical issue.
One thing that profile raises in my mind, Kate, is the idea of civil and social guardrail. And the Journal had a 1993 editorial that has become a classic on no guardrails. And the idea basically was that there are always people who have disturbed minds to some degree, but there used to be more family, faith, social connections that would help keep those people on the straight and narrow. And part of what has happened over decades is the erosion of those kinds of circles. And some of that may be related to the rise of online communities. The dark rabbit holes that people go down sometimes are more often than not these days, it seems, on social media, on the internet. But Kate, a lot of that also predates the rise of the internet.
Well, one thing I would recommend is that anybody who hasn't read No Guardrails, call it up and read it, because it is, I think, foundational to understanding our current political and social dysfunction. It talks about the anti-Vietnam protests at the Democratic Convention in 1968 and how the left basically justified violence as a way of settling your differences, and how that idea was accepted in elite parts of society, and how the justifications never really stopped and kept coming. I think that's relevant to the current moment. You know, Spencer Cox talked about one thing he said that I thought was very clear and helpful, was that he hears all the time that words are violence. Words are not violence. Violence is violence. And I think that is a tacit way of saying that political movements need to stop acting like violence is an acceptable way to resist your opponents. And so I do think, to your point about the fraying social connection, I think everyone at this point knows somebody who has marinated on the internet and a lot of fringe corners of the internet, who maybe doesn't trust traditional news media anymore and starts seeking out alternate sources of information. And ends up believing some very radical fringe things, who continues to consume it on the internet. So that is certainly part of the fraying that we're seeing in our social order.
Let's listen to another piece of Governor Cox's remarks. This includes the bit that Kate was mentioning a moment ago.
To my young friends out there, you are inheriting a country where politics feels like rage. It feels like rage is the only option. But through those words, we have a reminder that we can choose a different path. Your generation has an opportunity to build a culture that is very different than what we are suffering through right now. Not by pretending differences don't matter, but by embracing our differences and having those hard conversations. I think we need more moral clarity right now. I hear all the time that words are violence. Words are not violence. Violence is violence. And there is one person responsible for what happened here. And that person is now in custody and will be charged soon and will be held accountable.
Monet, what do you make of that? To my eye, that might be among the better statements from politicians that we've seen in the wake of this tragedy.
Yeah, I think those are wonderful comments and exactly right, exactly what people need to hear in the aftermath of Charlie Kirk's death. I think that the last part that he mentioned about one person being responsible is important to note, because a lot of people have been talking, and rightly so, about how the political climate has led to this type of violence, how the dialing up of rhetoric on both the left and right has encouraged young men who are adrift to go to extreme lengths. And that's true. Leaders need to be really cautious about what they say, and don't encourage people to take drastic actions or to villainize their opponents. But at the end of the day, even heightened political rhetoric is not itself violence, doesn't directly lead to this kind of attack that we saw. And we need to remember that the blame lands squarely and ultimately with the perpetrator of the actual attack. And more broadly, I think what Spencer Cox is trying to do is prevent retribution. There are going to be a lot of young conservatives, in particular, people who followed Charlie Kirk very closely, who are angry and who feel like they've had their worst views about American politics confirmed by his assassination, and feel as if they have no choice but to fight fire with fire, and potentially even with violence. And so he is counseling against against that. And you only have to hope that that message is going to be heeded, and that people are going to respond in a more positive way, and try to engage civilly in the way that it seems as if Charlie Kirk himself did during the course of his career, and would have wanted his followers to do.
Kate, notably that this has also been a theme of Spencer Cox's for a while now. Disagree better is something that he's been talking about for years. And in normal times, I get how some people it might strike them as a bit hokey, but this is the kind of time when I think we need a little bit more of that message. And to my eye, Spencer Cox is really rising to the occasion here.
Yeah, just one more small item on Monet's great point about individual responsibility is I think the implicit takeaway from what Cox was saying there too is that the criminal justice system exists to deliver accountability in this case. It's not something that people should just take retribution into their own hands, that we have taken this person into custody and now we will go through a very deliberate process to hold him accountable.
Another piece that struck me of what Cox said about social media was as often as you hear please to like and retweet, here is Governor Spencer Cox: log off, turn off, touch grass, hug a family member, go out and do good in your community, unquote, which is always, I think, pretty good advice. Another person I would mention as having a pretty decent statement is Bernie Sanders, senator from Vermont. Here's a piece of what he said in a video earlier this week.
Freedom and democracy is not about political violence. It is not about assassinating public officials. It is not about trying to intimidate people who speak out on an issue. Political violence, in fact, is political cowardice. It means that you cannot convince people of the correctness of your ideas, and you have to impose them through force. Every American, no matter what one's political point of view may be, must condemn all forms of political violence and all forms of intimidation. We must welcome and respect dissenting points of view. That's what our Constitution is about. That's what our Bill of Rights is about. That, in fact, is what freedom is about.
Both of those politicians' statements, I think, are in contrast to some of what else is happening in the political scene. I mean, Kate, that moment of bickering on the House floor this week when Speaker Mike Johnson led the chamber in a few moments of silent prayer for Kirk and his family, then followed by one of these Republican showboaters saying that wasn't sufficient, demanding that there would be some sort of spoken prayer. Somebody would lead that, and then shouts and bickering on the House floor. Let's hope everybody has reflected on that as not a message that is really one to send at a time like this to the public. Another thing that I would point to, though, as a good example, Kate, are the vigils that are taking place on many of these campuses where Charlie Kirk spent so much of his time organizing and building his movement, Turning Point USA. 100 students gathering at the University of Alabama. Here's a statement from one freshman: political violence has no place in America. This country was founded on the idea of freedom of speech, and we should all honor that. 80 people at a vigil in Duke, 100 at the University of Oklahoma, other reports of gatherings in Mizzou, the Citadel Military College in South Carolina. I'm sure there are more that are being organized here this week. Singing of America the Beautiful, people sharing Bible verses, sharing what Kirk's activism meant to them. Here's a statement from the college Republican chair at Oklahoma University. We have a choice in America. Do we continue down this extremist path, or do we try to have a healthy debate like Charlie Kirk would have wanted us to? Kate, I mean, that I think is heartening, because that is an example of some of these young people on these campuses doing the kind of thing that Spencer Cox is talking about, trying to disagree better, getting together, putting down the phones, meeting in person, and talking about a difficult thing that happened in America this week.
Yeah, I mean, to thread that all together, I think there are a couple more things that made Cox's remarks important. One of which is directing them at young people who, thousands of kids have seen this awful video of Charlie Kirk, and this will be part of their political formation now for decades to come. They'll remember this assassination, and it will influence how they think about the world. And so what they hear from politicians and the bickering matches they see about it do matter. And so Cox's willingness to speak directly to young people and tell them you have agency and your personal conduct matters, I think is a message consistent with that no guardrails editorial I was talking about, but also one that is falling out of political fashion all over the place, which is that your conduct matters, that you can choose how you respond to this event. So it has been encouraging to see, like you said, some kids on campus turn to quiet reflection and prayer, but there is that undeniable resentment and desire for retribution that can come from seeing an awful event like this. And so I think Cox deserves credit for speaking directly to it. I mean, we've talked a lot about how it's this was an attack on the ability to exchange ideas freely, but I think speaking directly to those young people who saw this was essential. And I do think Mike Johnson also deserves marks for suggesting that everybody needs to take the temperature down, which is not a popular thing to say and has not had as much influence with this conference and the general Congress as I would like. But there are politicians who are trying to use this as an opportunity to take the country in a better direction. And that's, again, to borrow one more line from Cox, he said, I think this is a watershed in America's history, but the question is whether it's the start of something very bad or the opportunity to change directions. And in free societies, you can change directions. And I think that's the most valuable message of Friday's speech.
Thank you, Kate and Monet. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button, and we'll be back next week with another edition of Potomac Watch.